Okay, so I'm going to go through chapters 10 and 11. So actually, I did this mostly color-coded where the black pen is chapter 10 and the blue pen is chapter 11. The main thing that happens in chapter 10 is that Atticus shoots a rabid dog and saves the town. And the main thing that happens in chapter 11 is that Jem reads to Mrs. Dubose as she's dying, but she continues to fight her addiction to pain medication, in this case, morphine. So remember how I said that these are kind of isolated events leading up to the trial, so it gives you good indication of kind of some background information, and you'll start to see that a lot of these ideas are going to come back in the trial. So we're going to start with Atticus. We learn a lot about Atticus throughout these chapters. At the beginning of chapter 10, the kids talk about how he's 50 years old, so he's too old to have any fun with. We know that he has strong morals. And he does say that he doesn't use guns, but he allows Jem to use a gun. But he does remind him that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. And that's the first time the title of the book comes into play. And we are going to see that it has symbolic significance. And throughout the book, I would say to you guys, think of who is represented as the mockingbird. The children talk about him being old, weak, and feeble. They're annoyed that he reads, that he won't play tackle football. But as we go through these chapters, the children learn more about Atticus. Atticus is seeking to instill a conscience within his children, seeking to instill morals and values in them. He leads by example. And at the end of chapter 10, Jem views Atticus very differently. He talks about him being a gentleman and states that he wants to be like him. So the children learn his nickname was One Shot Finch, and in fact, he's actually an amazing shot. But that they realize he chose to put the gun down, and they gain respect for their father and his morals. Atticus is not a weak man. He has chosen to do certain things because he thinks that it would be an unfair advantage to others. And again, most of the insight we gain about Atticus is through Miss Maudie, who is his character foil. Okay. And it's really important that we learn these things from Miss Maudie because exactly that. Atticus doesn't talk about himself. He doesn't tell them anything about himself. He doesn't brag. It's from Miss Maudie that we learn people in their right minds never take pride in their talents, said Miss Maudie. Your father's civilized in his heart. Marksmanship is a gift of God, a talent. Oh, you have to practice to make it perfect, but shooting's different than playing the piano or the like. I think maybe he put his gun down when he realized that God had given him an unfair advantage over most living things. I guess he decided he wouldn't shoot until he had to, and he had to today. And that's where they gain a lot of that respect for Atticus. From hearing Miss Maudie explain why their father chose to put down the gun. Atticus does say later that real courage is not a man with a gun in chapter 11, and that kind of comes back. So there are two connections that are really key. The connection in chapter 11, he says in chapter 10, real courage is not a man with a gun in his hand, because that's what he's showing them. In chapter 11, he says it when he's talking about Mrs. Dubois, that he didn't want his son to see that. And that's where the quote comes into play. I wanted you to see what real courage is instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. Atticus respects Mrs. Dubos's courage to break free from her addiction to morphine, and that even though she's dying and she's in daily pain, he greatly respects that fight and that desire to realize that courage is what's doing something that is hard. That is what courage is, right? Courage is the act of doing something difficult. It is not courage if it is easy for you to do. He also says in chapter 11, courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyways. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. This is his lesson on bravery, and that's partly why he respects Mrs. Dubose so much, is that he knows that as a morphine addict, she's trying to wean herself off in the moment of time when she needs the morphine the most. Because what morphine does is it makes you feel painless. It is an anesthetic. It is still used today, but it is easily to get addicted to it as well. It takes all of that suffering away. And yet when she's suffering the most and is in the most physical pain, that's when she's decided to quit using that morphine. There's also a connection to chapter 21. In chapter 21, Scout talks about her father in the trial, and she has the quote, "It was like watching Atticus walk into the street and pull the trigger, but watching all the time knowing that the gun was empty." And that is referring back to chapter 10. So in chapter 10, he shoots the dog with rabies. Rabies is a deadly disease. It is deadly to people as well. If you were bitten by a rabid dog, you will die, typically within 5 days. It's quite debilitating. There is no cure. And it's definitely something that is a horrible end for an individual. So we see a couple of things with that. Atticus represents those morals and the justice, that sense of righteousness. That is key to destroying racism and fear. The dog with rabies represents racism. We see that in the quotes, Macomb's usual disease, and when people go stark raving mad when anything involving a Negro comes up. And that was in chapter 9 and 10 when he's talking about, actually, I think that's chapter 9. When he's talking about why he doesn't understand his town's inherent racism. Hectatus the sheriff, he represents the law. He is powerless against the dog, just like he is powerless against the racial prejudice in town. The gun represents power. It's the potential to destroy the dog as well as the disease. We see that he's able to destroy the dog with the gun. But in chapter 21, we see that the gun is empty and he is unable to destroy the racism within the town. So these are all connected to chapter 10. Right? So the idea with the dog and the rabies and how the law is unable to do anything about it represents what is happening in the town. The law is unable to stop the rampant racism. The town individuals are like a dog with rabies. The townsfolk have this disease. They go stark raving mad over the trial. And Atticus is the only one who is standing up for what is right by defending Tom Robinson. So that's the main focus of chapter 10. We do see some other things. So we do hear about the mockingbird for the first time. It's a sin to kill mockingbird. And they give an explanation. It says they don't do anything but sing for pleasure. So they don't destroy crops. They don't do anything that's harmful to people's plants or gardens. And that's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. We see that later on when I told you that the mockingbird represents people. There are going to be some individuals who do not harm anyone and who are completely innocent. So when we see some of these themes, we see both of them in chapters 10 and 11. So for innocence, Jem is starting to grow up and lose his innocence. He starts to value his father's beliefs. And it also is another example of how innocent the children are because they don't understand how Atticus can be so polite to Mrs. Dubose when she's insulting him and when she's rude to him. They're a bit naive. They don't understand why he would treat someone with respect even when they are being disrespectful. And that highlights that Atticus has a strong conscience, that he's able to rise above this. He doesn't react in anger to someone who is mean. He rises above them, right? Just like we would encourage you guys to do, to rise above the base instinct of punching someone in the face, and to be able to walk away and to feel for that individual instead. Strength and power. So Miss Maudie's comment, people in their right minds never take pride in their talents. That is the true strength. The idea that Atticus' strength comes from within. And we see this later in other chapters as well, when in the next couple of chapters, men come at Atticus with guns There's nothing in Atticus's hands except a book. He doesn't bring a gun to defend himself because he feels he doesn't need to. So again, that strength we see within Atticus is an internal one, and we see that he has that power and authority because of who he is and because of his morals and values. Atticus supports Mrs. Dubose because she's ill, and yet is trying to break her morphine addiction. That also highlights how he sees that strength within her, and he values that. Racism. So we've seen some of these quotes. Macomb's usual disease. It's that underlying prejudice of society, the prevailing attitudes and biases within society. And he also talks to Scout when she is commenting that other people are calling him the N-word lover, other racist names, or why they would use derogatory names in the first place. And he says, "It's never an insult to be called what somebody thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you." And it highlights that idea that people pick on others when their lives are challenging. And Atticus recognizes that. And again, he rises above that. And that is what he's teaching his children. Atticus is a great example. He is that moral figure, very godlike in his ability to be able to teach his children what is right. And that's really what this book is about. It's about a father trying to show his children how they can go through the world and deal with some of these really challenging facts. Freedom we see in chapter 11. She died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I knew. And that's what Atticus says about Mrs. Dubois. This is very high praise for Atticus. The fact that he thinks she's one of the bravest people he knows. And it highlights an interesting thing. Mrs. Dubois is not a nice person. She's racist, she's mean, she's cruel. There are reasons for that, right? She's dying a slow and painful death. And yet Atticus, even though he does not condone her actions or her words, he does have respect for her because of her other actions. So it highlights kind of how you can respect certain parts of someone, even while condemning other aspects. And Jem asks, did she die free as the mountain air? And that kind of highlights and connects to the symbol of Mrs. Dubois. She's represented as that mountain. She's strong, she's old, she's set in her ways, she's cold, she's harsh, she's demanding. But she states she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. And it's that strength of her will that we see. As the children read to her, she is pushing off the time and distracting herself to get over her morphine addiction. At the end, this is the beginning and the end. At the beginning, Jem destroys the snow on the mountain flower camellias, which is a flower, again, representing that mountain aspect, representative of Mrs. Dubois. And at the end, when she dies, she gives him a camilla as well. And so he reacts in anger, but then he also keeps the flower. And she gives this to him to thank him for his help. And it kind of like brings us a sort of conclusion to their relationship. So it's just beauty despite that harsh personality. And even though she's a challenging individual, she values that Jem has helped her out, and she recognizes that in the end. Gender roles. Gender roles are like a subtle underlying theme throughout the whole novel. So Mrs. Dubois picks out weaknesses in Scout. She's not ladylike. She even comments that she's going to end up as a prostitute at the OK Cafe. This is important because Scout is constantly reminded of her shortcomings in the realm of women, usually by other women, especially Mrs. Dubois and her aunt Alexandra that we see in chapter 13. She's constantly critiqued for not being a woman, for not being ladylike, for being too rough around the edges. And so even though she's trying to fight these stereotypes and these norms, she struggles with that because it's a constant attack on her. Friendship. So Atticus explains some more reasons of why he has taken this case. If you have read ahead, you would know that he has taken the case of defending an African-American man against a white man and his daughter, which is astounding to the town that someone like Atticus, who people do respect, would take the side of an African American individual. And so he explains to Scout, the one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience, and that it is your own internal thoughts and feelings that you have to live with, right? You have to live with your choices. And Atticus's choice is how to be a good person, how he can abide by his conscience, and his conscience has dictated that it is right to defend Tom Robinson. And he again says to her, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man. So Atticus believes it's right to help Tom. And this is another example of a strong religious influence. So earlier in the book, we saw how the author critiqued hypocritical reasons in religion, individuals who would say that there's nothing in the world that you could love and you must be sitting at home in the house reading the Bible every day. Atticus kind of destroys that as well as Miss Maudie. And you're going to see more of that. You're going to hear a lot more from people in the town who go to church and worship God and yet try to kill a man in the night. Whereas Atticus talks about how he is not able to go and worship God if he didn't try to help him, because that is what is right. So you see both sides of religion. Okay, you see individuals who will manipulate religion, use the parts that they wish, and destroy other parts. They'll say, well, it's okay if we murder someone as long as we have a good reason. Whereas then we see the idea of truth and following what is morally right and following that conscience, which is represented through Atticus in these actions. So you see both sides of it, and you see that the author is critiquing this side of religion and upholding this side. And that is what is happening in chapters 10 to 11.